The restaurant was closed on Tuesdays, silent and cavernous. Evelyn Reed didn't summon me to an office. She met me in the center of the empty dining room, where the chairs were stacked on tables like skeletal remains. She held a tablet, its cold blue light reflecting in her sharp, analytical eyes. "Your food costs are unsustainable." Her voice was crisp, devoid of any emotion. She swiped a finger across the screen, displaying a series of graphs and charts that meant nothing to me. "And your menu, Liam, is not aligned with our profitability targets." It wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict delivered from on high. Evelyn, a manager from the private equity firm Reed Capital Ventures, had owned the Gilded Spoon for less than a month, and she was already preparing to dismantle everything I had built. I am Liam Carter, 38 years old, and until this moment, I was the head chef here in the city of Oak Haven. For 7 years, I had poured my life into this kitchen. I had taken this place from a forgotten corner bistro to one of the most celebrated restaurants in New England. My art wasn't about flashy techniques or the fleeting trends of molecular gastronomy. It was about honest food, food that could awaken a memory you didn't even know you had. It was a philosophy, a belief that food could be a form of art that remembered our lives for us. "We need a new culinary identity," she continued, her gaze fixed on the data as if it held all the answers. "Something more buzzworthy, more aligned with social media optics. Truffle foam, perhaps. Espuma-style sauces." I felt a cold stillness spread through me, a quiet, deep-seated anger that I refused to let her see. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my work. To do so would be to acknowledge that her metrics had any meaning in my world. I simply gave a single, sharp nod. "I understand. When is my last day?" She finally looked up from the tablet, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. She had clearly expected me to plead, to fight, to bargain for my position. My quiet acceptance seemed to unnerve her more than any outburst would have. But I don't beg for people to understand a language they are incapable of speaking. My grandfather, Antonio Moretti, had taught me that a man's worth is in his work, not in the opinions of those who cannot appreciate it. For 7 years, I had honored his memory with every plate that left my kitchen. 7 years of poring over his tattered recipe notebook, a legacy of handwritten notes and stories from his life as an immigrant chef. 7 years of building a reputation on the simple, profound truth that the best food connects us to our own humanity. Evelyn offered a tight, relieved smile. 2 weeks should be sufficient for the transition. She said it as if she were granting me a favor. "You'll need to provide detailed, digitized recipes for all signature dishes, of course, for the new chef's reference." I nodded again, the silence in the vast room amplifying the hollowness of her words. We both knew the truth. The real recipes weren't written down anywhere. They lived in my hands, in my memory, in the feel of the dough and the smell of the sauce. They were not data points to be transferred. That evening, during my final stretch of services, I watched my team move through the kitchen with the fluid grace of a perfectly rehearsed orchestra. Oscar Diaz, my fiery, passionate sous chef, commanded the grill section with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. Chloe Chen, our pastry chef, plated her desserts with the meticulous precision of a sculptor, each element a brushstroke of genius. Young Ben Morrison, a kid I'd trained from the ground up, worked with a quiet, earnest loyalty that I knew was directed at me, not the restaurant itself. They didn't know yet. None of them knew that the soul of this place was scheduled for eviction. After the last table had paid and the doors were locked, I sat alone at the bar, a glass of bourbon cradled in my hand. The dining room was dark, save for the single spotlight above the bar top. I ran my fingers over the worn, smooth wood, a surface that held the ghosts of thousands of conversations, of celebrations, of quiet moments of connection I had helped create. The next morning, Oscar found me in the kitchen, carefully wiping down my personal knives before storing them in their worn leather roll. "Liam, what are you doing?" he asked. his voice tight with a suspicion he clearly didn't want confirmed. I didn't look up from my task. Evelyn and I had a conversation yesterday. I told him everything: the tablet, the charts, the cold, clinical language she used to erase 7 years of our lives. Oscar's face, usually so animated, hardened into a mask of fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the steel prep table. He was a fighter, a man who had scraped and battled for every opportunity, and he could not comprehend surrender. "That woman knows nothing," he spat, his voice a low growl. "This place is a success because of what you do. Because of us. It's her restaurant now, Oscar," I said, my voice deliberately flat. I finally met his burning gaze, letting him see the deep, weary calm that had settled over me. "She wants a different kind of food. But this is your heart on a plate," he insisted, his voice rising with passion. "People don't come here for social media optics, they come for your food. For an experience." I snapped the final buckle on my knife roll. The click echoed with a painful finality in the silent kitchen. Not anymore. As I walked to my car that evening, I paused and looked back at the familiar, glowing sign of the gilded spoon. A knot twisted in my gut. It wasn't sadness. Not exactly. It was something sharper, colder. It was the quiet, steely resolve that told me this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. My grandfather, Antonio Moretti, opened his first small restaurant in Naples when he was just 22. He came to America with nothing but that notebook and a belief that food was the universal language of family and memory. I grew up in the shadow of his legacy, watching him create magic from simple flour, fresh eggs, and vegetables he'd haggled for at the morning market. Food in our family was never about being fancy. It was honest. It was history. It was the anchor that held us together. I never planned on becoming a chef. My father, Robert Carter, was a successful businessman who valued stability and pragmatism above all else. He paid for my education at the Culinary Institute of America, seeing it as a respectable but temporary diversion before I came to my senses and joined his firm. But after graduating at the top of my class, I chased my own path, spending years staging in kitchens across Europe. The chaotic, beautiful rhythm of a professional kitchen felt more like home to me than any corporate boardroom ever could. It was a world my father couldn't understand, and my choice to embrace it was a disappointment he never hid. We hadn't spoken about anything that truly mattered for over a decade. I worked my way up through 4 different kitchens in New England before I landed at what was then a struggling bistro with a tired menu and an air of defeat. The owner, Samuel Jones, was a kind man on the verge of giving up. He was ready to lock the doors for good. Instead, he took a chance on me, giving me complete control of the kitchen. "Make food that means something to you, Liam," he'd said, his eyes full of a gentle desperation. "Because I'm all out of ideas." So I did. I built a menu from the pages of my grandfather's notebook. The 6-hour braised lamb with rosemary and juniper berries. The rich seafood stew with a saffron broth his own mother had taught him to make. The delicate olive oil cake, soaked in orange liqueur, that was a staple at every family celebration. And people noticed. First, the locals who lived down the street. Then the critics from the Oak Haven Chronicle. Soon, tourists were making reservations weeks in advance, having read about us in magazines. We never chased trends. We aimed for something more enduring. We became a necessity. Mr. Jones sold the restaurant when his wife fell gravely ill. He needed the money for her medical care, and I understood completely. The first group that bought it mostly left me alone. Their CEO visited once and told me, "Don't fix what isn't broken." For 3 years, that philosophy held, and we thrived. Then they sold the restaurant and its sterling reputation to Reed Capital Ventures. To Evelyn. She began making her presence felt almost immediately, walking through the kitchen during prep time, asking questions that revealed a profound ignorance about food. She would bring in clients and friends during the busiest hours of service, sending back perfectly cooked dishes because they weren't, in her words, photogenic enough for their social media feeds. 2 weeks before she fired me, I overheard her on a call in the hallway. "We'll keep the name for now," she'd said, her voice sharp and decisive. "But everything else is changing. New concept, new chef, a whole new energy." I should have started preparing then. I should have seen the writing on the wall. But a naive part of me, the part that still believed in the power of the work itself, couldn't fathom that anyone would intentionally dismantle something so beloved, so successful. The night before my last day, I cooked all of our signature dishes one final time. I tasted each one, not to check for seasoning, but to burn the exact flavors into my memory. Not that I needed to. These dishes were a part of me written into my DNA. My last night at the Gilded Spoon was deliberately quiet. There was no speech, no farewell party. I just worked the line, as I always did, though my hands felt heavy, each plate a small goodbye. After closing, I left my keys on the sterile surface of Evelyn's desk. Beside them, I placed a neatly typed list of recipes, the generic, soulless versions we kept on file for the health department. They were instructions, not recipes. Not mine. I drove home to my small apartment overlooking the city and opened a bottle of Barolo I had been saving for a special occasion. I suppose this was one. I sat on my balcony, watching the distant lights of Oakhaven twinkle, and I felt a profound emptiness. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was just a hollow space where 7 years of my life's work used to be. The next morning, my phone buzzed incessantly with texts from the kitchen. Oscar. Chloe. Ben. Evelyn had already brought in a new head chef, a trendy name from Boston known for his work with foams and gels. "He's already changing everything," Oscar's text read. "Rearranging the stations, talking about deconstructing your menu." I didn't respond. I turned off my phone and went for a long walk through the city, the autumn air crisp against my face. 3 days later, Oscar appeared at my door. He was still in his kitchen whites, but they were rumpled, and his eyes were wild with frustration. "It's a complete disaster," he said, pushing past me into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. "The new guy. He can't replicate anything. He's trying to follow the recipes, but it's all wrong. The taste, the texture, it's a joke. They have the recipes," I said calmly. Oscar shot me a look that was a mix of exasperation and respect. "They have the words you wrote on a piece of paper, Liam. They don't have what's in your head, what's in your hands." I just shrugged and poured him a glass of water. "It's a new chef, a new restaurant. That's how this business works. But the regulars are noticing," he pressed, his voice full of urgency. "Mrs. Carpenter sent back the lamb twice last night. Twice. She said it tasted like a stranger had cooked it." Mrs. Carpenter. She had come in every Thursday for 5 years, always ordering the lamb. She once told me, with tears in her eyes, that the taste reminded her of a year she had spent in a small village in Italy, right after her husband passed away. It was more than a meal for her. It was a memory. "They're planning a huge relaunch next week," Oscar continued, pacing my small living room. "Critics, investors, influencers. The whole circus. Evelyn is calling it the Gilded Spoon. Evolved." Something shifted inside my chest. It wasn't satisfaction. Not yet. It was the first glimmer of recognition. The beginning of an answer to a question I hadn't yet allowed myself to form. "Are you looking for a job?" I asked him, the words surprising me as much as they did him. Oscar stopped pacing and stared at me. "What?" "My grandfather's old restaurant downtown. The building has been empty since he passed away. I still own it." A slow realization dawned on his face. "You're thinking of opening your own place? A real place?" The thought hadn't been fully conscious until that very moment. But saying it out loud crystallized it into a hard, clear purpose. I had poured my soul into someone else's dream, only to have it sold for parts. Maybe it was time to build my own. Maybe I am, I said, a faint smile touching my lips for the first time in days. Are you interested? Oscar didn't hesitate for a second. Hell yes, I'm interested, he exclaimed, a fire lighting up his eyes. And I can guarantee you Chloe and Ben will be right behind me. That night, sleep was impossible. I found myself pulling out my grandfather's old notebook. The leather was cracked and the pages were stained with olive oil and wine, filled with his spidery handwriting. There were half-formed recipes, notes about suppliers, and anecdotes about customers he'd served decades ago. On the inside cover, in faded ink, he had written a simple sentence. The food remembers even when people forget. I traced the words with my finger, feeling a deep connection to him across the years. Something stirred within me then, something powerful and clean. It wasn't anger at Evelyn. It wasn't a desire for revenge. It was the simple, profound need to cook food that mattered again. Food that was mine. In the week that followed, the local food blogs and Instagram feeds were buzzing about the changes at the Gilded Spoon. They posted pictures of my dishes, now grotesquely deconstructed. A dollop of foam where a rich sauce should have been. A tiny, artfully arranged portion that looked more like a science experiment than a meal. The comment sections were a bloodbath of disappointed regulars. What have you done to the menu? This is a travesty. It's not what made this place special. Bring back Chef Carter. I was in my grandfather's old restaurant space, the air thick with the smell of dust and old memories, scraping peeling paint from the walls. When my phone rang, it was Evelyn. It was the first time I had heard her voice since she'd fired me. Liam, she said, her tone sickeningly sweet, like honey laced with poison. I was just calling to see how you are. I'm fine, Evelyn, I replied, setting my paint scraper down. We're experiencing some transition challenges here, she said, the false casualness in her voice grating on my nerves. I was hoping you might be available for a short-term consultation, just to help smooth things over with the new team. I let the silence hang for a moment. What kind of challenges? She paused, and I could almost hear her calculating her next move. Some of the signature dishes. They aren't coming out quite as expected. Our new chef is exceptionally talented, of course, but the regulars are noticing certain discrepancies. You have the recipes, I stated, repeating the same cold fact I'd given Oscar. Yes, but it seems there are nuances, details that weren't in the documentation. I almost laughed out loud. Nuances. Like how I adjusted the seasoning on the lamb based on the spring grass the sheep had been grazing on. Like how the seafood stew needed a touch more acidity when the local catch was briny. Like how the olive oil cake needed 5 fewer minutes in the oven on a humid summer day. These weren't nuances. They were the soul of the craft. I could compensate you very generously, she purred. And we would, of course, credit you as a consulting chef on the new menu. I'm busy, Evelyn, I said. Look, Liam. Her voice hardened, the velvet glove slipping off to reveal the iron fist. The relaunch event is in 3 days. We have major critics and my investors flying in. I need those dishes to be perfect. Then you shouldn't have fired the only person who knew how to make them. The line went dead silent. I could feel her fury crackling through the phone. I will double your last salary, she bit out. Just for 2 weeks of your time. No, triple it. It's not about the money, Evelyn. Then what is it about? She snapped, her frustration boiling over. Some pathetic, wounded pride? I made a business decision, Liam. And now I am making another one. Good luck with your relaunch. I hung up the phone and went back to scraping the paint from the walls, each stroke feeling like I was reclaiming a piece of my own history. An hour later, Oscar called. You're not going to believe this, he said, his voice a low whisper. She's in the kitchen right now. Evelyn. She's standing over the line cooks, watching them try to make your food, taking notes on a tablet. It's insane. 2 days before the relaunch, I was at the farmer's market, inspecting a crate of late-season tomatoes, when Mr. Jones found me. "Liam, heard what happened," he said, his kind face etched with concern. "I also heard a rumor you might be opening your own place." News in the Oak Haven restaurant community traveled faster than a kitchen fire. "I'm thinking about it, Mr. Jones." "Good for you," he beamed. "You know, that woman called me yesterday. Evelyn asked if I had any of your old notes or records from when you first started." She sounded desperate. I raised an eyebrow, a slow, grim satisfaction beginning to bloom in my chest. "What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth," he said with a chuckle. "I told her your food was always a kind of magic to me, and I never had the first clue how you did it." He picked up a heavy, ripe tomato and weighed it in his hand. "She's in deep trouble, you know. Her investors, they didn't buy a restaurant. They bought a reputation, the one you built." That afternoon, I got a text from Chloe. "They're on their 5th attempt to reverse engineer your olive oil cake. It's still coming out like a brick. I almost feel sorry for them." Almost. I smiled. That cake had taken me 2 years of trial and error to perfect. Good luck with that. The night before the big relaunch, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door. I opened it to find Evelyn Reed standing on my doorstep, looking completely out of place. I was so surprised, I actually let her in. "One last offer, Liam," she said, dispensing with any pretense of pleasantry. "Come back. I'll give you full creative control. A 20% ownership stake in the business." I leaned against my kitchen counter, folding my arms. "Why the sudden generosity, Evelyn?" "Because the dress rehearsal tonight was a catastrophic failure," she admitted, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Because our reservation book for the next month is filled with people who are expecting your food. Because I made a strategic miscalculation. For a fleeting moment, I actually considered it. 20% was a life-changing number. But then my mind went to my grandfather's dusty, empty restaurant. I thought about the clean, honest feeling of scraping that old paint, of building something that was truly mine from the foundation up. "I appreciate the offer, Evelyn," I said, my voice even. "But I've already started something new." Her expression shifted, the mask of negotiation falling away to reveal something cold and venomous. "If you are even thinking about opening a competing restaurant," she said, her voice dropping to a low threat, "you should remember your contract. There is a non-compete clause. You are legally prohibited from opening any establishment within a 5-mile radius for the next 2 years." The words hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't remembered that detail buried deep in the boilerplate I'd signed years ago. "Good to know," I said, my voice betraying none of the sudden ice in my veins as I held the door open for her. "Good luck tomorrow." The moment the door clicked shut, the facade of calm I'd maintained began to crumble. I immediately called Marcus my cousin. He'd been my lawyer and my closest confidant since we were kids. He'd always been the one to talk sense into me. I explained the situation, the words tumbling out in a rush of anger and anxiety. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "She's not just trying to protect her investment, Liam," Marcus said finally, his voice grim over the phone. "She's trying to bury you." He confirmed it. The non-compete was real, and it was almost certainly enforceable. My grandfather's place was only 2 miles from the Gilded Spoon. I had hit a wall I never even saw coming. That night, sleep was a distant country. I paced my apartment, my mind racing through impossible scenarios. Delay the opening? Move to another town? Fight her in court and risk being bankrupted by her corporate lawyers? At 3 in the morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to my grandfather's building and sat on the dusty floor of the half-renovated space, the weight of it all pressing down on me. The next morning, the day of the big relaunch at the Gilded Spoon, I was in Marcus's office, running on caffeine and despair. He had the contract spread out on his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There might be a way," he said slowly, tapping a paragraph with his pen. "A loophole. The non-compete is very specific. It prohibits you from opening a similar restaurant concept with competing cuisine within the 5-mile radius. I looked at him, not understanding. So, similar concept is what I do. Your concept at the Gilded Spoon was contemporary New American with Italian influences, correct? He asked. But your grandfather's original restaurant, what was that? It was a traditional trattoria, I said. Straight up, old school Italian. I'd been planning to cook my food, my style, an evolution of what I'd done before. I hadn't considered. What if I didn't evolve? I said, the idea taking root in my mind. What if I went backward? What if I recreated my grandfather's restaurant exactly as it was? His recipes, no changes. Red and white checkered tablecloths, Chianti bottles with melted candles, the whole thing. A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. It's a completely different concept, a different target demographic. She could still try to fight it, but her case would be significantly weaker. It's a risk, but it's a smart one. She's playing on a field of spreadsheets and legal threats, he added. You need to change the game. Fight on a field she can't even comprehend, the field of authenticity. I thanked him and left, my mind buzzing with a new, defiant energy. I had been so focused on proving I could rebuild what she had destroyed, I hadn't thought about resurrecting the foundation it was all built on. On my way home, my phone buzzed with a text from Ben, who was working his last shift at the Spoon. Critics are here. Food's going out cold. New chef is losing his mind in the walk-in. I swiped the notification away. It wasn't my battle anymore. That evening, Oscar, Chloe, and Ben came over to my apartment. They looked like soldiers returning from a lost war. It was a bloodbath, Oscar said, slumping onto my couch and gratefully accepting the beer I handed him. A complete and utter train wreck. The lamb was gray and tough. The stew tasted like dishwater, and the olive oil cake. He gestured to Chloe. It was an insult, Chloe said, her usual composure replaced by a quiet fury. A dense, greasy puck, an offense to butter and sugar everywhere. Evelyn kept making excuses to the tables. Ben added, shaking his head. She blamed the suppliers, the ovens, the humidity, anything and everything but the obvious. And the obvious is, I asked, though I already knew the answer. That they don't have you, Liam? Ben said, his voice quiet but firm. We sat late into the night, talking through the wreckage. How the new chef, for all his trendy credentials, couldn't grasp the soul of the dishes. How the critics had barely hidden their disappointment. How Evelyn had vanished into her office halfway through the service, leaving her staff to face the fallout. There's more, Oscar said, leaning forward and lowering his voice. I overheard her on the phone with an investor. She was screaming. It sounds like she leveraged everything Reed Capital Ventures had to acquire the Spoon, promising them a quick flip for a massive profit based on its existing reputation. Chloe nodded. A reputation built entirely on your food. She's in trouble, Ben concluded. Serious trouble. Without glowing reviews from this relaunch, she's going to lose her backing. I should have felt a surge of triumph. A bitter, satisfying, I told you so. Instead, all I felt was a strange, cold clarity. This was never about food. It was never about hospitality or craft. It was about assets and liabilities, about turning something beautiful into a number on a balance sheet. I'm opening my grandfather's place, I announced to them, my voice filled with a conviction that surprised even me. I'm going back to the beginning. Traditional Italian. His recipes, his way. No compromises. What about the non-compete? Oscar asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I explained Marcus's loophole, the strategic retreat to a battlefield of pure tradition. It's a different concept, a different story, I finished. And honestly, if she wants to waste her money fighting me on it, let her try. I think her restaurant is about to have much bigger problems. The next morning, the first reviews of the relaunch appeared on the Oakhaven Chronicle's website. They were as savage as my team had described. A soulless imitation of a once great restaurant. All gilded, no substance. The heart of the gilded spoon has vanished. That same afternoon, I didn't just rent my grandfather's old space. I went to a pawn shop and sold the vintage watch my father had given me for my graduation from the CIA. It was the last truly valuable thing I owned, and the one tangible link to a past of unmet expectations and silent disapproval. Letting it go felt like a final, necessary sacrifice. I used the money to sign the lease on the small, forgotten storefront right across the street. A temporary outpost, a place to start immediately while the main restaurant was being restored to its former glory. I would call it Carter's Table. No frills. No gimmicks. Just food that remembered. On a hunch, I drove past the Gilded Spoon that night. The parking lot, usually full, was depressingly empty. A hastily printed paper sign was taped to the front door. Limited menu tonight. The unraveling had already begun. 3 weeks later, Carter's Table was ready. It was nothing fancy. Just 12 tables, freshly painted white walls, and my grandfather's old copper pots, polished to a warm glow, hanging in the open kitchen. I'd handwritten the menu myself on simple cardstock. 5 appetizers, 5 entrees, and 3 desserts. They were all his recipes, unchanged since he had perfected them half a century ago. I had been meticulous with the legalities. Marcus had reviewed every permit, every license, every piece of paperwork, building a fortress of documentation to protect us if Evelyn decided to make trouble. But so far, there had only been silence from her camp. According to Oscar, who had quit the Spoon along with Chloe and Ben the day after the relaunch, Evelyn was too consumed with trying to stop her financial world from imploding to worry about me. The night before we opened, my father called. It was the first time he had initiated a call in at least 15 years. "Your mother told me you're opening a new place," he said, his voice gruff, carrying the weight of years of unspoken words. "Opening tomorrow," I confirmed, my own voice tight. "I'm using Nano's recipes, all of them. Just like he made them," I added quietly. There was a long pause on the line, so long I thought he might have hung up. "He would be proud of that, Liam," he said finally, his voice softer than I'd heard it in years. More proud than he would have been of another businessman in the family. A knot formed in my chest, a mixture of shock and a deep, ancient longing for this exact approval. You should come by sometime," I stammered. "Maybe I will," he said. "And Liam, I still have his old recipe book, the real one, with all his personal notes. Your mother and we thought you should have it." I hadn't even known it still existed. "Yes," I breathed. "I would like that very much." 2 days after we opened, with no advertising save for a single, elegant Instagram post from Chloe, we had a line stretching down the block. Word had spread like wildfire through the network of the Gilded Spoon's spurned regulars. Liam Carter was cooking again. We served 40 covers that first night, a frantic, beautiful chaos powered by just the 4 of us. Me and Oscar in the tiny kitchen, a whirlwind of heat and motion. Chloe and Ben working the front of the house with a grace and professionalism that made the small room feel like the grandest dining hall in the world. Every single dish went out exactly as my grandfather would have made it. Simple, perfect, and honest. A week later, Mrs. Carpenter, the Thursday lamb regular, found us. She walked in, took one look at me standing in the kitchen, and burst into tears. She hugged me right there in the middle of the dining room. "I've been looking all over for you, Liam," she sobbed. "Nothing has tasted right since you left." That night, I added my grandfather's braised lamb to the menu. Just for her. 2 weeks in, we were booked solid every night, with a waiting list that grew longer by the hour. I hired 2 more cooks and another server, all of them young, hungry, and eager to learn. My father sent the recipe book. It arrived in a carefully packed box, a tattered leather journal filled with my grandfather's secrets. There were notes on where he sourced his ingredients, sketches of plating ideas, and stories about what each dish meant to him, to our family. Holding it, I felt his presence in the kitchen with me, a quiet, guiding hand on my shoulder. On the 1-month anniversary of our opening, I arrived early to find a crisp manila envelope taped to the front door. My heart sank. Inside was a formal letter from Evelyn's lawyers, alleging a breach of the non-compete agreement and threatening immediate legal action. I handed the letter to Marcus over coffee that afternoon. He scanned the document with a calm, almost bored expression. "Right on schedule," he said, taking a sip of his cappuccino. "I was wondering when she'd get around to this." "Can they shut us down?" I asked, the anxiety creeping back in. He set down the letter and looked me in the eye. "They can try, but I've been building our defense since the day you decided to do this. I have documented evidence, sworn affidavits from suppliers, and a stack of customer testimonials, all confirming that Carter's Table is a traditional Italian restaurant based on historical family recipes. It is a fundamentally different business from the contemporary New American cuisine at the Gilded Spoon. Different concept, different price point, different market. So, we're safe. We're better than safe, Liam. Their argument is incredibly weak. And you want to know the best part?" He leaned forward, a glint in his eye. "Their position is made even weaker by the fact that the Gilded Spoon itself has completely abandoned its own original concept." This was news to me. "They did?" Marcus nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Went full molecular gastronomy last week. Foams, gels, smoke, the works. They're desperately chasing the latest trend, trying to find an identity. In doing so, they have legally admitted that they are no longer the same restaurant you used to work for. Her lawsuit is DOA." I smiled. A real, deep smile of relief. That evening, as I was prepping for service, a man walked in and took a small table in the corner. It was the lead food critic from the Oak Haven Chronicle, the same man who had written the scathing review of the Gilded Spoon's relaunch. He didn't know that I recognized him. He just ordered his meal, and I had just cooked. I sent out food that I knew, in my bones, would have made my grandfather proud. Next morning, his review was the headline of the lifestyle section. The heart of the Gilded Spoon didn't vanish, it read. It just moved across town, put down new roots, and found its true, authentic home at Carter's Table. By noon, our reservation list was completely full for the next 3 months. 6 months after Carter's Table opened, I received a call from Mr. Jones. "Have you seen the news, Liam?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "Seen what?" "The Gilded Spoon. It's for sale. Reed Capital Ventures is liquidating the asset at a massive loss." I hadn't known. I hadn't really thought about the spoon in months. I had been too busy running my own place, expanding the menu with more of my grandfather's treasures, training my staff, living my life. "The asking price is less than half what she paid for it," Mr. Jones continued. "She's desperate." "Not my problem," I said, though I felt a quiet sense of justice settle over me, not of triumph, but of balance being restored. That afternoon, Marcus called. "Just got off the phone with Evelyn's legal team," he said cheerfully. "They're dropping the lawsuit. Seems their client has bigger problems to deal with." "Like selling a failing restaurant?" "Exactly. And get this, her own investors are suing her for misrepresentation. They claim she sold them on the value and reputation of a restaurant that she herself systematically destroyed." I thought about that as I prepped for dinner service. I thought about the shortcuts Evelyn had tried to take, the soulless, transactional way she viewed the world. She had seen only the glittering surface of what made the Gilded Spoon special, never understanding the deep, unseen foundation of history, craft, and community it was built on. 3 days later, it was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, during a lull between the lunch and dinner rushes. A sleek black town car pulled up outside. Evelyn Reed stepped out, straightened her expensive jacket, and for a moment, I thought she was going to come inside. But she didn't. She stood on the opposite sidewalk, a solitary figure under a black umbrella, and simply watched. Her gaze was fixed on the scene inside my restaurant. She saw the warm light spilling out onto the wet pavement. She saw the happy, lingering lunch customers, the easy smiles on the faces of my staff as they prepped for the evening. She saw Oscar commanding the kitchen, Chloe presenting a dessert to a delighted table, and Ben greeting a regular by name at the door. She was watching a world she had briefly owned but never understood. A community she had tried to monetize but had only succeeded in alienating. A form of success that could not be measured on a spreadsheet. She stood there for a long, long time, completely still in the downpour. Then she slowly lowered her umbrella, turned, and walked away into the gray, rainy afternoon, swallowed by the city. I never saw her again. The following week, the Gilded Spoon closed its doors for good. The building remained empty for months, a dark, silent monument to ambition without soul. I didn't celebrate its failure. I didn't need to. The food and the people who loved it had already spoken. 1 year to the day after opening Carter's Table, we expanded. The renovation of my grandfather's original building next door was finally complete. We kept the small cafe as our lunch spot and opened the main, larger restaurant for dinner service. His old, gleaming copper pots still hung in the new kitchen. On our grand opening night, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching the new dining room fill up. There were families and couples, old regulars who had followed me from the beginning, and new faces drawn by the stories they had heard. Oscar came up behind me and nudged my shoulder. "You going to just stand there and stare all night, chef, or are we going to cook some food?" I smiled, a genuine, happy smile, and returned to my place on the line. Halfway through a chaotic, wonderful service, Chloe appeared at my side. "Liam, there's someone here to see you." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked into the dining room. There, at a quiet corner table, sat my father. He stood as I approached, automatically extending his hand in a formal, business-like gesture. I ignored it and pulled him into a hug. He was stiff for a moment, then relaxed into the embrace. "The place, it looks good, son," he said, his eyes scanning the bustling room. "It looks right. It's just like Nano had it, with a few small updates," I admitted. But the heart of it is the same. We talked all through his meal. It was the first real conversation we'd had in decades. We talked about my grandfather, about food, about Italy, and about what it truly means to build something that lasts. As he was leaving, he pressed a small, old-fashioned key into my hand. This was the key to the small vineyard Nano owned in Campania, he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "He left it to me, but it should be yours now. It's part of his story. Your story." That night, long after the last customer had gone and the staff had headed home, I sat alone at the bar with a glass of my grandfather's favorite Amarone. The dining room was dark and quiet, filled with the ghosts of a successful night. On the wall behind the bar, I had hung a framed copy of that first review from the Oakhaven Chronicle. The heart found its true, authentic home. I had never set out to destroy Evelyn Reed or her ambitions. I had only wanted to build something real, something that honored my grandfather and the craft he had passed down to me. In the end, that was more than enough. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply having the courage to do what you were always meant to do, and to do it with all your heart. I raised my glass to my grandfather's memory, to my father, and to the empty chairs that would be full again tomorrow. This place wasn't just a restaurant. It was a legacy. It was home.